Lovely. Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to Myosh for the opportunity to present today. It's great to be back. Greencap have been associated with a number of these, so great to be part of this session today. So as Sarah said, my name is Brad Perose, Practice Manager for the Property Risk Group at Greencap. And today's presentation is entitled Managing Building Compliance Through COVID-19 and Beyond. Now, 2020 has turned out to be quite the memorable year, starting with droughts and fires and floods, and now in a global pandemic that we currently find ourselves in. And many of you would have seen the economic update from the government yesterday, which showed that there was a fairly severe economic contraction in the June quarter. And that was largely because of our workplaces. Our workplaces were affected in some way due to this global pandemic. We were prohibited from trading, or we had our trading impacted, or our businesses decided voluntarily to vacate the premises or vacate their workplaces for a period of time. And that certainly showed up in the economic data. But what it means, though, is that when a workplace changes, when something impacts the workplace, it also impacts the facility and the building within that workplace operates. And that's the crux of today's presentation, is around how do we manage building compliance through COVID-19 and beyond, given those significant changes that have happened to our workplaces within those facilities and buildings. So we'll kick off with a poll, and the question I'd like to put to you all, and the poll is up there now, is what is the current operational state of your building and workplace? How is it right now? And you may have a different perspective on that. You may be a tenant within a building or a facility, so that might be your perspective, or you might be a facility manager, so you might have a perspective that relates to the entire building. So either approach is correct. So I'd just like to put that question to you. And the options today are your state. The current state might be you're in a full shutdown situation, where there's very limited or no occupation. There might be restricted access. Your building might be in full shutdown, and the shutdown might involve also building systems and equipment. Your workplace might be partially occupied, where some tenants or some of your workers are currently occupying the space. It may be majority occupied. You may be in a state other than Victoria, for example, where your workplace is functioning at almost normal capacity, but with workplace square meterage limitations in place, for example, or your workplace may actually be back to full operation. There's also an opportunity to include other as a potential option. So grateful if you have a situation, or if your current state is not one of those, grateful if you could put that into the chat function. And we will reveal the poll answers soon, but I'll advance to introducing the presentation structure. So we'll start with introduction and context, and shortly I'll introduce you to our expert panelists who will be speaking today. But the presentation will be proceeding in the way of a moderated panel discussion, so it won't be death by PowerPoint. We'll be hosting something of a panel discussion where I'll be asking questions of our expert Greencap panelists, who will be given the opportunity to speak to you about some of their perspectives on managing building compliance in this environment that we're in at the moment. We'll talk through different phases of restrictions, and then how managing building compliance is influenced by various phases within the coronavirus environment that we're in. So we'll talk about some of the considerations that need to be thought about under severe restriction scenarios, under eased restriction scenarios. We'll talk about what we might have to consider if we have to return from somewhere on that continuum where we've eased restrictions, but then have to loop back to severe restrictions. For example, if we've had an outbreak in our building or our facility, or within the suburb or local area that we're in. And we'll also talk about some of the considerations when moving beyond the COVID-19 pandemic as well. And then there'll be an opportunity for question and answer where you'll get the opportunity to ask our panelists questions that are relevant to you. And please stick around to the end of the presentation. We will have a downloadable resource for you. I might ask Sarah to put that link now in the chat so that you've got access to that. And then we'll also reveal that, that link as well further in the presentation as we get to the end. So I'll now introduce you to our panelists. If I can ask our panelists to please switch on their cameras, and I'll just provide a quick introduction. First of all, that's me. I should also point out these are our pre-pandemic images, by the way. So I've already introduced myself. Our other panelists are Dr. Chong-Chi Go. Chong-Chi is our principal property risk consultant with over 30 years experience in the delivery of fire safety and property risk compliance audits, essential services audits and full function fire tests for properties such as shopping centres, commercial, industrial and residential apartment buildings, for asset owners, facility managers, as well as documenting and implementing business continuity plans, crisis management plans for major shopping centres. Also introducing David Hauser. David is a team manager within our property risk group at Greencap and has a broad knowledge of property risk and compliance, work health and safety legislation and risk management services, with over 16 years experience implementing health, safety, wellbeing and manual handling programs across Australia, and has key experience in the development and implementation of safety management systems, health and safety assessments and program implementation to reduce risk for his clients. And now, Sarah, if I can get the results of that poll up, please, and we might just see, before we move on to discussion, see where everyone is. And hopefully everyone can see that, but it looks like the key response there is partially occupied. And that's certainly the case for Greencap as a business as well. Just to let you know, we have offices all around the country. Victorian office is obviously under severe restrictions, but we have voluntarily chosen in other parts of the country to return on a minimal basis. So only where we need to be in the office, for example, our lab, they're back, but everyone else is strongly encouraged to work from home, and that's obviously seems to be the case for many of the participants in this forum. So that's great. Thank you, Sarah. So I guess just a bit of a graphical representation of how of what we would consider the various scenarios to play out amongst through this pandemic. So many of us have been through the severe restrictions scenario. Victoria's currently there or back there. You've also then got the ease restrictions, and there's always the risk that there might be a return to more severe restrictions. So we may not necessarily get to the point where we're beyond COVID-19 before there's a return to perhaps more severe restrictions, and that might be, as we said, localized outbreaks or outbreaks, statewide outbreaks, for example, where we might see that localized return of restrictions. And all of these different states of play with respect to restrictions have different impacts and different implications for what we need to think about when we're managing the risk and compliance associated with a building or a facility. So when we're talking about severe restrictions, what might that involve? Severe restrictions currently in place in Victoria and certain hotspot areas in other industries, in other local geographic areas as well. But it could involve things like partial shutdowns, whether mandatory or voluntary. It might be voluntary from the perspective of a business's attitude to the risks involved. It might involve a full shutdown of the workplace or building. Pandemic safety plan, including physical distancing measures, would be in place. Building maintenance works may only be limited to mission critical activity. But at the flip side is there may actually be opportunity for other building work or for other projects to proceed, given the changes in the occupancy of a building. And there's also potentially the introduction, as we've seen in Victoria and as we've seen on the state boundaries, introduction of work and access permits as well. So first question to our panelists, and Dave, I'll throw this to you. In your view, what do we need to manage to maintain compliance in our building under a state of severe restrictions?
Thanks, Brad. So yeah, look, there's obviously across the country, there's a number of different restrictions imposed, and depending on your perspective, some may be severe and some may not be. But as Brad mentioned in the previous slide, obviously all businesses that want to operate in one way, shape, or form must have COVID return to work plans and processes and safety plans to make sure that their workers are not put at risk, and that needs to be done in consultation with their workers. But they also need to consider things like preventive maintenance programs. So we mentioned previously that it's important to maintain equipment that is essential for the building operations, and Chong-Chi will, I'm sure, talk more about the fire safety side of things. But there's also other elements that are considered essential. Things like the air conditioning systems for the building, particularly your water, your warm water systems, like your cooling towers. They obviously need to be maintained appropriately if they're not in full use, because they're reliant on them being in full use or in use of some sort to reduce the risk of other bacteria such as Legionella. But if you decide that something like that is going to be shut down, then there also needs to be processes that are appropriate to make sure that you're reducing the risk of build-up of bacteria, as I said, such as Legionella and the like. There also needs to be a consideration around your cleaning regimes. And that's not just making sure that you're disinfecting the workplaces, which obviously is important, and making sure that that any potential virus or the like is on surfaces, but also removal of waste and refuse during and before the restrictions come in, because what happens and what we've found is that a very short period of time it's required for people to, I guess, vacate a workplace, particularly if there's an outbreak or a positive case, and that can mean that there's food waste and other refuse laying around the building, which can increase the risk of pests and vermin and other infestations like that. So making sure that there's a program to be able to remove that prior to the restrictions coming in or prior to vacating the workplace, and then obviously making sure that there's an appropriate cleaning methodology put in place for the disinfection of the workplace, and that's probably one of the most important things, is not just going out and wiping down what you think is appropriate, but actually having a methodology to make sure that the workplace is being disinfected correctly. And then what we've seen recently is the increased use of hand sanitizer, which is great because it's obviously a great way of killing the bacteria and the virus, but also considering that with that hand sanitizer you're bringing in other risks. So you're providing the hand sanitizer throughout the building, your building or your facility for people to use, but that can also lead to the need to store additional quantities of hand sanitizer, and as we've probably seen on the news, there's been a number of incidents where this hand sanitizer is generally as a minimum 70% ethanol or alcohol, which obviously creates a fairly significant flammability within that chemical. So making sure that the hand sanitizer and any of those chemicals are appropriately stored, so that there is no or a lower risk to additional fire risk, and also making sure that you're complying with the legislation within your jurisdiction. When you hit a threshold of 250 litres of hand sanitizer, as I said, it's a flammable liquid, so it's a class 3 flammable liquid. There is requirements around having additional placarding installed at the workplace, and then if you hit a significant quantity, and we're talking around the 2,500 litres, which most businesses don't, but if you're bulk storing it for any reason, maybe for a distribution need, then there's a need to have a manifest and also notify the local work safe or safe work body. And then obviously the operational side of things, you need to consider things like your business continuity arrangements, so remote access, provisions of working from home, video conferencing as we're doing today, those sorts of things too. And then one of the things we've also noticed recently is some industries and some businesses are actually ramping up their operations. I spoke about hand sanitizer and having to distribute that. So the logistics type industries have also seen an increase. Some of the manufacturing industries, toilet paper initially has increased. So that might also bring in the need to have additional workers at the workplace, and therefore you might need to adjust your measures within the workplace to fit for those workers. You might have to provide additional toilet facilities, or you might need to provide additional space to have appropriate social distancing measures put in place. So there's a flip side to everything as well.
Yeah, I mean, looping back to hand sanitizer, I mean, back in April, you couldn't buy any, right? So, it seemed that in April and May, every distillery was retooling the production to produce hand sanitizer. And it's obviously, now the place to wash with hand sanitizer and has to be stored somewhere. So, what are you seeing out there in the industry? What are you seeing out there, in the logistics space around the storage of hand sanitizer and the risks around that?
Yeah, it's definitely been a bit of a sharp learning curve for a number of industries and buildings that I've been to personally. Obviously, there's 250 litres sounds like a lot, but it's actually not that much when you think a box of hand sanitizer with 1 litre bottles in it. You might get 6 in a box, and it doesn't take many boxes to have that. And if your workplace is working as your company's distribution hub, for example, or storage hub for this, then there's a potential that you could easily exceed those thresholds. And so what I've seen is a lot of these hand sanitizer bottles, whether they're still in the boxes or whether they're out in the in a bulk container, are essentially not being stored in an appropriate way. So I've seen them being stored in boxes in the car park, for example. Being stored in on bun, which on a bun, but the bun wasn't sufficient to take the quantity of chemical it being stored with. And then we've also had the cases where we've had some people contact us talking about significant quantities, and we're talking 40,000 litres. We've even had one client who was in the million of litres mark, mainly for supply. So they saw it as a business opportunity to increase their or change their business model. And they hadn't taken into account any of the requirements around storage of this. And there's a fairly sizable standard that talks about the requirements. And so they needed to go back to the drawing board to work out exactly what they need to provide, not just from a storage perspective, but also from a fire protection, and then also the legislative requirements to make sure that their staff and the neighbourhood in general isn't put at risk, because you can imagine 40,000 litres of fairly flammable liquid is like a time bomb. If it went off, it would go off pretty hard and very hard to put out once it's going. So it's definitely something that needs to be considered.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess sticking with the fire safety and essential services theme, Chong Chi, perhaps you've got some perspectives on this as well. So what do you, in your opinion, Chong Chi, do you think we need to manage to maintain compliance in our building under a state of severe restrictions?
Well, I mean, from fire protection system perspective, the system that the fire protection system and equipment that is installed within the building will still need to be maintained. That's the important thing. It still needs to be maintained regardless of what state or stage of restriction you may be in. In fact, well back to March, early March this year, when the whole pandemic situation happened in Australia, FPA, which is the Fire Protection Association of Australia, they put out an article called Fire Protection During Coronavirus Shutdown. In the article, it actually says that one should continue to maintain or even perform the installation and maintaining, so that the system will function, because the building is still operating, although it may be under partially shut down or full shutdown. There will still be some people on site that you need to make sure that the safety of the people are being looked after. We have mixed feedback from contractor perspective in terms of during this severe restriction because of the access to the premises. Some contractors share that they are able to get more things done, and weekend works could be brought to the weekdays work because they are allowed to access the premises. However, there's also another pool of properties out there where asset owners are just saying, look, we don't want anyone to come on site, and then they could not access and maintain the essential safety measures. In terms
okay.
of for Victoria, when Victoria enter into the stage 4 restriction, I guess the only changes is that any person going on site to do the work will need to apply for the so-called permitted work permit to make sure that they have the right paperwork, so that when they are stopped by the authority, that they can demonstrate that they are actually performing some essential services in the industry.
Yes.
The other thing that we need to also remember is that although there are minimal number of people on site, in fact, speaking to some of the FM and PM, some of the properties are even going down to less than 1%. So in that situation, you would imagine that from emergency management perspective, if there is a so-called emergency incident, what would somebody needs to do? In a norm, you will have the warden structure doing a bit investigation, you have the chief warden. In fact, in this situation, we advise that because of the skeleton number of people on site, upon hearing the alarm, the protocol should be evacuate immediately. So these are the things that FM, PM, and owners needs to think through as they manage this building under different restrictions.
Yeah, it's interesting, and you know, humans are the best fire detector there is, and when you're down to 1% occupancy, it's and you don't have a fire detection system or a sprinkler system, you know, there's potentially greater risk to the asset as well in terms of fire spread. But just in terms of annual certification, so that's obviously driven at state level. Most jurisdictions require you to submit some kind of annual fire safety statement or something like that. None of that's been suspended as far as I'm aware. There's still an obligation to do that. But what are you seeing in relation to enforcement activity from authorities around the need to get this certification in? Are you seeing any changes in attitude as a result of, particularly around the severe restrictions scenario, particularly in, well, you're in Victoria, Chongqing, so you might have some perspectives there, but perhaps more broadly as well?
I think in Victoria, although we do not need to submit a annual declaration, the asset owner or the agent will still need to complete a declaration to confirm and to demonstrate that all the essential safety measures are being maintained.
Yeah.
In fact, we have some experience with jurisdiction in New South Wales, which is where you are, Brad, and we have some experience with the council where they have shown some leniency in terms of the lodgement of the annual fire safety statement. And then because they understand the severe restriction and the constraint that the people will be facing during this challenging time. Some councils have actually deferred any enforcement action until late September, but this is not uniform. You can't rely on that. And then you should be doing what is right, which is try your best to complete your statement if it's due.
Yeah, great. Excellent. Thanks, gentlemen. I'll move on to the next question. And to the audience, I'll also point out that you're welcome to get your questions in now through the Q&A function of the presentation. Obviously, we won't address those till after the presentation towards the end, but yeah, feel free to drop those in, and we'll address those when we get there. So on to the next section. So in relation to ease restrictions, some of those conditions may involve, and ease conditions are currently what we're experiencing in most states and territories of Australia, apart from primarily Victoria and the border regions of the various states and territories. But ease restrictions may be return to the workplace for many. Some buildings may have still limited occupation, but on a more voluntary basis, perhaps, as opposed to mandated by government. Pandemic safety plan, including physical distancing measures, still in place. There may be both essential and non-essential building maintenance activity happening in facilities and workplaces. The reinstatement of projects that have previously been put on hold, and the implementation or continuation of certain building access tracking systems as well. So, Chongqing, I think I'll throw it to you first this time. What additional services or projects do you think we need to consider when restrictions are further eased?
I think we touched on the fire protection system, regardless of whether you're in the severe restriction or ease restriction, that still needs to go on. The challenges previously faced by in conducting those maintenance during the restriction period may no longer be there. Sites site previously, which was locked down, may be open now. So it will mean that it will be easier, hopefully, for contractors to come on site to carry out the work.
Yeah.
However, you will still need to maintain the social distancing, wearing of masks and the PPE and so forth. Those will depend on your state's regulation and so forth. From emergency management perspective, you will now get to see more and more people coming back, hopefully. And then in such situation, I think emergency management is very dynamic because how are we going to track who is on site? And then would the chief warden be on a rotation basis? And how would FM and PM work with security and even working with the tenants to get a register who is on site and who is not on site? So emergency management would be something that needs to be looked into carefully in terms of how to address the people coming in. And it could be, you may need to have more training for the warden structure, or you may want to still implement a very simplified emergency management, which means that during this ease of restriction and a limited number of a workforce, we will still evacuate people during if there's a building alarm and not having the norm emergency management system in place. So, but however, this still needs to be communicated. And with more and more people coming back, the use of vertical transportation will be a challenge in fact, I have done a few testing during this time and previously when Victoria was in the so-called ease restriction, we only allow maximum 3 or 4 people in a lift car. And imagine when more and more people coming back onto the building and then and everyone trying to get to their different levels, and potentially there will be a queuing or congregation of people in the lift lobby. So you will need to maintain social distancing and all that. And people in this situation will tend to use the fire stairs. So which means that people would use the fire stairs and to get out to the level that they need to go to. And that will pose another challenge. It is something that needs to be looked into.
Yeah, so what sort of challenges do you envisage there, Chong-Chi? So obviously very tempting to use fire stair. Most buildings have them, particularly, mid-rise, high-rise buildings that have fire stairs, and it must be tempting not to use lifts where you have to, cram in or, spend an entire morning getting people up to their floors. So when using fire stairs, well, first of all, can you use fire stairs? Is it allowed? Are you allowed to use fire stairs for normal general building access? But if you are, and if you can, what are the sort of things that we need to look at?
In fact, most jurisdictions does not explicitly prohibit the use of fire stairs in a non-emergency situation. They are designed for emergency situation, but the BCA did not say that you can't really use it in a non-emergency situation, because there are certain so-called criteria in the design of the fire stair, which is quite different to when you design the normal stair for the normal use. For example, your fire stair balustrade do not have to meet the size opening and the horizontal bar and so forth. You do not need to have a tactile ground surfacing or even the color contrasting in the fire stairs. So for someone to then use this as a normal access to their tenancy, potentially there could be a bit of a concern with OHS issue in terms of slip, trip and fall. And the fire stair is not air conditioned. So it is not a very nice environment to be in. And if you need to basically walk up 10 flights of stairs, it could be quite challenging in that way. So I guess these are the issues that FN and PM will need to work with the tenant and then address that to make sure that fire stairs, if they want to use it, there should be certain SOP that needs to be followed. For example, you can't chop open the stair doors. It needs to remain closed. The tendency for people is then to chop it open so that they do not have to open the stairs. And certain stairwell have got a swipe card that you can't access and you can access. So there's all this complication that needs to look into.
Yeah, great. Excellent. Dave, can I get your perspectives on this, please? So under the state of play where there are eased restrictions in play.
Yeah, so as Chong-Chi said, they're obviously makes work a little bit easier to conduct. There's less administration around it, getting permits and things like that. But you also need to consider how easing the restrictions and increasing the potential number of people back in the workplace impacts the building you might manage or be part of. So things like I mentioned previously about the cooling water systems or cooling towers. So if they've been shut down or put down onto a lower power mode, then you may need to have a specific documented process to restart that, because that's where you get your risk of something like Legionella being put out into the community by having a tower that was poorly shut down initially. It may have sat there for a couple of weeks or even as short as a couple of days, which means that the water stagnates, and that's where you get an increased risk of the growth of the bacteria. And then you turn the towers on, they start removing the heat out of the water and potentially putting the bacteria up into the atmosphere, which then becomes breathable. So very similar to how we essentially catch COVID, by breathing it in and so on. So that's one thing to consider. But then also considering, as your workplaces or as your workforce starts moving back into the building or starts reoccupying, how are you going about disinfecting the workplace so you know that it's safe for them to re-enter the workplace? But also, if your workplace has been dormant for a period of time, there's a definite risk of additional dust, potentially mold and other contaminants that may have built up. So making sure that that's also considered as part of the cleaning process is not just focusing on cleaning out potential virus, but also other elements like dust and so on. And then we mentioned before about the hand sanitizers and the additional units and those sorts of things. So making sure that you've got an appropriate number of units around, whether it's within your workplace specifically, or whether it's within your building or at the entry to the building, at entries and concierge levels, toilets and so on, and also making sure that you're being making your cleaners aware of those high touch areas, things like handles, buttons on lifts, handrails, those sorts of areas that people can't really go around without touching. So making sure that they're being wiped down regularly to reduce that risk of potential passing viruses or other things onto other people, and also considering when you are looking at the hand sanitizer units and the location of them, consider how they're placed around the building. I've seen a number of different buildings, particularly in shopping centres where people have used the hand sanitizer. They're an automated unit. They put their hand under it, doesn't work. They take their hand back out, and the hand sanitizer falls in a big blob on the floor, and it obviously does dry, but it can, if it's being used like that regularly, it can puddle up and create a slip hazard. But you can also have that trip hazard as well, where you might have a powered unit that's not battery operated, that's plugged in, and the lead may be across a walkway, or even if it wasn't originally, it may have been moved there by people walking over it, or those sort of things. So there's other elements around providing those types of services. And we're all aware of the need to now have these building recording systems, so systems to record when people enter a building or enter your workplace. So things like scanning QR codes, manual access logs, the COVID Safe app, or potentially even linking it to your visitor or contractor sign-in portals. But yeah, making sure that you've got a robust system in place to cover off on people and monitoring people, because that's the best way to contact trace a potential outbreak for this. And the other thing that I have also noticed, particularly in New South Wales, because as I said, most people, or a lot of buildings are starting to slowly go back, or were slowly going back to some level of moderate occupancy. A lot of people are now scared, and rightly to be, of catching public transport, because there's you don't know where the person in front of you has been, or those sorts of things. And so people are starting to use their personal vehicles more to transport from work. So therefore, you're increasing potential risk of additional traffic management hazards within your workplace. So yeah, you have a car park that normally is 2/3 full, and now it's bursting from capacity. and you need to now manage that because you might have additional interactions of people within the car park, but also that entry and exit point of your car park too.
Yeah, excellent. All right, thanks for that, Dave. Look, I am mindful of time. We'll move on to the next phase. So the next state of play, or the next potential scenario that one might face, would be a return of restrictions. So we think we're out of the woods, and then all of a sudden we're back almost where we started due to perhaps a localized outbreak or so on. So some of the things to consider, or some of the conditions that return of restrictions might involve: returning to partial or full shutdown of a workplace or a building. A return to essential works only, a shutdown of building systems, a full building clean and disinfect may be necessary or mandated, and also the wearing of mandatory PPE potentially. So, Dave, I'll start with you. What do you, in your opinion, think we need to do or consider to prepare ourselves in our buildings for any potential future restrictions that might be reimposed?
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm assuming a lot of buildings have done, but it's also worthwhile going back and revisiting now that we've got a bit of experience with a number of buildings, and particularly in Victoria, going back to in their case a more severe lockdown than was originally mandated. But having processes in place to manage some of those high risk types of equipment, cooling towers and air conditioning systems, fire safety and so on, to make sure that you have a process to maintain them or to shut them down, and making sure that they're not posing an additional risk either during the shutdown period or after. The other thing that we've found, particularly when we've gone out to site to do inspections, is that the tenants have packed up, locked the door and walked away, and they're not available to allow access into the property. So it might be that they have access to the roof through their tenancy, or it might be that they have the fire system within their tenancy, whatever it is. So having that consideration within your particular workplace or your building to make sure that you still have access to the entire part of the building. Also making sure that with your contractors, making sure that you have looked into contracts and looked and discussed with your contractors how any new shutdowns may impact their work, and if they would be considered essential. And if it does impact their work, do we need to consider maybe night works or out of hours works to cover off on the particular the different restrictions within those jurisdictions. So having a look at those different aspects of the maintenance program within your building. And then there might be also the looking at your security procedures. So Chong-Chi mentioned about the fire stairs and potentially using them as a way of accessing between levels, which in some instances is okay, but can also increase the security risk because people might chock open doors or not have access to a particular floor that they need to have access to, and the only way that the building management system can do it is by providing access for everybody, and therefore you're increasing your security risk. But also, if there's restrictions come in that require additional or reduced number of people within a building, making sure that you've got enough security to be able to handle that. So if you've got a building that can only have 30 people in there, you need to be able to have a system that can track that 30 people, so you're not having more people or less people coming in. More people, not less people. And also making sure that you have appropriate arrangements to restrict that. And I've seen that a lot in retail, where you've got a small to medium-sized retail shop that might have 5 or 6 people allowed within that location. They've actually now had to line up outside. So maintaining all those social distancing outside as well as inside the area as well.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Dave. Chong-Chi, your thoughts?
Well, I guess now that we've been through the scenarios of severe restriction and ease restriction, and any potential in terms of returning back to the restriction, hopefully will help us to be more prepared, I believe. And the key approach here is to engage all parties. In fact, you need to engage asset owners, the FM, the tenants, and to make sure that they are all aware that there are certain essential services that still needs to be maintained and still need to perform. And our experience so far is that many tenants and owners, they are not aware about the obligation, and that during this challenging time, and hopefully through this session and through communication and all that, that they are aware about their obligation. And owners and tenants, they may impose a higher degree of maintaining personal hygiene and practices during site visits and wipe downs of the areas after the work's been completed. So there's all these things that needs to be taken into consideration, and through the lesson that we've learned, and hopefully we can just improve in the way we manage the building better.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much, gentlemen. On to our second and last poll of the day. To the audience, I ask you, what are your greatest concerns about reopening buildings and workplaces? And Sarah, if you could put that poll up, please. Thank you. It may be, again, your facility might be partially open or not open at all. What is your concern about perhaps going from partial to full open, or from completely shut down to a partial or full open state? So again, your own perspective can be put on your own on your answer to that question. Just to talk you through very briefly the potential responses. Your greatest concerns might be the disease itself, personally contracting disease or having your colleagues contract disease. Might be around general safety, the general workplace safety risks that might have arisen over the course of a shutdown period, and now you're reoccupying the space. It might be around operational impact, delays in supply chain, limits to workplace configuration and so on, and building access and so on. Or it might be financial impact, increasing the cost of services, additional cleaning, supply of goods, and so on. Or you might have something completely different and completely separate to all of that you're concerned about. And if you do, please add that to the chat function in the poll. So I'll briefly introduce the state of play, and then I'll ask Sarah to put up the results of that. So the final state of play, I guess, is beyond COVID-19. So those conditions might include building occupation maybe back to normal or almost normal, given that people may have changed the way they choose to do work in the future. Full operation of building systems, pandemic safety plan, including physical distancing, becoming much more eased or non-existent, and the return of pre-COVID-19 building programs and projects and so on. Sarah, if you can please share the results of that poll, please, and then we'll move on. COVID-19. Yep. Okay. That makes sense. So 53% there. Next was operational impact, and looks like general safety and financial impact. Well, financial impact pretty much bringing up the rear. So that's great. Thank you for that. So state of play beyond COVID-19, beyond the current situation, what considerations are there for maintaining and improving our building compliance? And I think I'm throwing this one to Chong-Chi. Chong-Chi, can you please, very briefly if you can, just provide your thoughts on this?
I think beyond COVID-19 would be the best place to be in. And then we'll be transitioning. Yes. We will be transitioning back to the normal operation. Yeah. And I think the one very important factor is to consider the typical office workforce beyond COVID-19 will be very different to pre-COVID-19. What was the norm previously may not be the new norm now that we are in. And with many people now working from home, organizations may allow more people now to work from home in the future. And this would obviously impact the workforce in a workplace for those who choose to go back to the office. As such, any emergency management plan that you put in place previously will need to be reviewed, because you may not have the right warden structure in place, although people are starting to come back. And as I said previously, they are very dynamic. You need to review them all the time during these challenging times, and to make sure that they're appropriate and applicable at the time that you are in. So more trainings may need to be carried out to make sure that new people are being trained out, and your ECO structure could be very different to what you previously have.
Great. And Dave, can I get your brief thoughts on this state of play, please?
Yeah, so I guess when we finally get to the other side of this, which will be a happy day for everybody, but I guess the things that need to be considered are re-implementing some of your safety compliance programs. That might be undertaking regular building inspections or getting an external consultant to do something like that, identifying the hazards, making sure that your your contractor management system is in place and robust enough, so that you're reviewing things like their safety documentation and licenses, provision of permits, making sure that you're reviewing and upgrading any of your safety systems. So you may have had prior to COVID-19 and prior to the shutdown, a program to upgrade all your ladders, for example, and that had to be put on hold for the time being. So making sure that you're reviewing what was previously identified as safety programs, and then implementing them as you can. And then, as I mentioned before, I think the way we use our workplaces and the way we access our workplaces is going to change significantly, even after everything sort of subsides. So,
yes.
Significant traffic management risk, a lot more people driving to and from work, or potentially working from home. And therefore, when they're coming to work, they've got to be able to access their workplace safely. So, and obviously all these changes, whether it's within the pre-COVID, during restrictions or after restrictions, or even after everything subsides, the consultation with all your workplace is really important, making sure that they're aware of any changes in the situation, but also making sure that they're providing their feedback, because what might work for your workplace in theory may not necessarily work in practice. So it's important that consultation occurs at all stages and all phases, so that appropriate information is provided to the workers and vice versa.
Great, excellent. Thank you, Dave, and thank you, gentlemen, for those insights. Hang around; we'll get you to answer some questions from the audience. So, to the audience, if you do have any questions that you'd like to put to our expert panelists, please do so in the Q&A function, and Sarah might ask you to monitor that and let us know when they pop up, and perhaps read them out, and then we'll refer them on to the appropriate panelist.
I will do. Okay, we don't have any questions at the moment. Do you want me to share that resource again just now, Brad? Thanks.
Yes, please. I'll also, while we're waiting for those, I'll also advance to the next slide and flag that. So we've made a downloadable resource available to you as a bonus for participation in this, along with the CPD points that are on offer for this webinar as well. So you can go to that the website greencap.com.au/myosh09, and Sarah will also share that in the chat. You can copy that and plug that into your browser as well, and download that material. That'll just provide some additional information based on what we've discussed today. Just a couple of high-level dot points around how you can manage building compliance of your building facility through those various phases of restrictions.
Okay, and yes, we'll be putting your contact details in the email that will go out later today too. So if they think of any questions they have, I'm sure you guys will be very happy to answer those as well.
Of course, absolutely.
So it doesn't look like we have any questions.
There's one that's come in the chat.
Okay.
Hi gents, about the concerns you listed. Mine is how do you ensure people in the building in respect to all the procedures that have been put in place in the building. So I assume that's talking about how do you make sure that the people are complying with the procedures that have been put in place, and I'll have a crack at answering that. So
yep, great.
So look, I mean, it's like anything. You can't necessarily be 100% certain that somebody is complying with what you've got in place. You can only do what's reasonable in the essence that you put the procedures in place. You provide the systems. You provide the PPE and the equipment, and you need to rely on your workplace or your workers or even the visitors and the people attending your workplace to be to comply with that. And part of that is, as I said, in that consultation phase, whether that's part of the induction program or whether it's part of a pre-COVID type or pre-attendance type screening, where you might send them your COVID safe plan or some main dot points for that, and then run them through in a little bit more detail. I mean, there's been a number of incidences, and it's quite interesting reading some of the news articles about who's been fined and why they've been fined, and things like that. I mean, I think I saw somebody in Victoria has been fined the $1,670 odd or whatever it is 24 times. So, you know, somebody like that, I don't think you'll ever be able to get the message across. But you know, it's no matter how many systems you put in place, there is always that element of potentially non-compliance, which is like in anything. And it's just a matter of trying to make the systems that you're considering to put in place or that you've got in place are, I guess, robust enough and easy enough to use. So you don't want to have somebody filling out a 10-page document just to enter your site, because that's, I guess, a guarantee that compliance is going to be minimal. Whereas if you give them the ability to complete that via you know, a pre-screen or even you know, an online portal or even a portal at the workplace entry, you're minimising the need for people to potentially, you know, people want to generally I think people want to do the right thing. So you want to make sure you give them the systems in place. I mean, for our workplace, for example, we have a QR code. So anybody who enters the workplace literally just scans a QR code with the camera on the phone. They don't need a scanner or anything like that. Takes them to the web page. They put in their details, their name and their mobile number, and that's it. So there's no need for picking up a pen. There's no need to sanitize you know, an access log or anything like that. So there's ways out there, and there's you know, some very clever people developing very, very sophisticated ways that are very simple to use to make sure that people do comply with your procedures and your processes. So I hope that's answered that question. There was a second question in the chat, and then there was one in the question.
Yeah, we'll do the one in the chat first.
Yep.
This is probably a good one for both panelists. I might start with you first, though, Dave, from a work health and safety perspective, and then Chong-Chi from a building regulations perspective. What is the likelihood that post-COVID that building regulations will change permanently post-COVID, such as maximum people lift and so on? Dave?
Yeah, good one. I haven't seen a huge amount of suggested changes to legislation. The only big change that I'm aware of under legislation is that obviously WA, and if we're going to move from WA, they'll be aware that their health and safety legislation specifically is still quite old. It's 19, I always get it wrong, 96, I think it is. Or could be even earlier than that. They were in the process of implementing the harmonised legislation. That was all put on hold because of COVID. So that obviously will now start to be pushed through again. So there'll be some changes like that. I think you'll find that social distancing requirements, whilst they're not necessarily legislated or won't be long-term legislated, they will have these requirements put in place for a long time. And I think they will be part of, say, like codes of practice. For facilities and things like that, to recommend that there is enough spacing between people, desks and so on. You might also find a more emphasis on working from home arrangements and safety around that, because I know a lot of businesses did it before COVID, but it's definitely become much more of a norm. I mean, we've been working from home since March, so yes. And counting, and not that we are counting, but it is definitely wearing on us. But making sure that people have a correct setup, so the ergonomic side of things, and doing those sort of in-home type assessments to determine that people are setting their workplace up, because whilst it's at home, it's still a workplace, and so there'll be more emphasis on some of those changes in how we do our work, rather than what's already existing.
Yeah, great. And Chong-Chi, from a building regulations perspective, building code, anything like that, do you foresee any changes that might fall out of this pandemic?
I have not heard anything or any talk about building regulation changes in terms of the restriction for the use of lift.
Yep.
Obviously that if a lift only allow 4 people, then it's going to be a big challenge to transport 5,000 or 6,000 people in a high-rise building in a normal situation. So I do not think that will happen. It's a matter of I guess we are all waiting for the vaccine basically, and then this interim measure of restriction has helped in the workplace that there are not a lot of people on site. But as we start to see more and more people coming back, it could be certain groups of tenants may allow to work on certain days. I do not know. I mean, so these are just the thoughts behind how to manage all the various tenants in a high-rise building. Of course, in a typical small building, that's not a problem. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, we do have 2 more questions. So very briefly, first question we'll go to, with regards to QR code, should this be happening in a shopping centre environment? Dave, your thoughts on that?
It's a hard one.
Yeah.
I think the advantage that a lot of shopping centres, particularly larger shopping centres, have is they've got a lot of space. So social distancing can be maintained. Smaller shopping centres, less space, enclosed, probably there's a higher risk there. I mean, it goes back to, back up to that first question we answered about compliance. And I, without even looking into it or without even thinking too hard, I can already see a number of logistical issues related to trying to get a QR code type arrangement set up in a shopping centre. But that being said, I've seen larger, outdoor venues like pubs and things like that implementing QR codes very, very, very easily and effectively. So it could happen. I think part of the process, I think from my understanding from the government's concept around having these building access logs or systems, as well as having the COVID safe app, allows for both instances. So whilst I know that a lot of the contact tracing they've been doing has been coming off the logs that buildings have been implementing themselves because it's easier than using the COVID safe app. But if that doesn't work, or if there's no system like that, like at a shopping centre, I think that that's where that's a fallback plan ultimately. But yeah, look, it's a tough one. I haven't seen it implemented in any shopping centres, to be perfectly honest. But I've seen it other large venues that potentially would work in. But yeah, I mean, most shopping centres have multiple locations. But I mean, yeah, you might have individual shops that would have it. So like, a Coles or a Woolworths might implement something like that, or even a small specialty shop might implement a program like that as well.
Sure. Okay. And the very last question, small unused bottles of flammables such as sanitizers, must they be stored in a flammable goods cabinet? Dave, you're the expert. If you've got space in the cabinet, then yes, I would store them in there. If they're finished and they're not going to be used again, then I would dispose of them. One of the things that, as I mentioned, is this sanitizer. A lot of the sanitizer has a high alcohol or high ethanol content, which means it evaporates very quickly. So if you do, if you do want to dispose of it, or do you want to get rid of it, and there's a little bit left, you can always open the top of the lid up and let it evaporate over a period of time. Mind you, that would produce a fume that can potentially build up. So if you've got lots of them, that could potentially become a risk itself. But yes, so if they're not going to be used down the track, then I would definitely dispose of it appropriately. If they are going to be reused, so you're going to refill them, then I would in the interim store them in a cabinet if you've got a cabinet. If you don't have a cabinet and you only store a couple of small bottles, then you don't necessarily need to go out and buy an expensive cabinet just to store a couple of bottles, because the risk isn't great enough. But as long as you store them appropriately, so having them on a bund or in a containment box, so that if they do spill, they would reduce the need for clean up and so on. Sure, excellent. All right. Once again, thank you very much, gentlemen, and thank you to Miles for the opportunity to present today. As Sarah mentioned, the downloadable resource link is available in the chat, and Greencap is available to take any further questions you might have following on from this presentation. So, Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, gentlemen, and Anne for helping to arrange this. I will just drop a link in here. There's a couple of Greencap webinars coming up next month as well. So they're always great source of information. And as you know, we're also getting the CPD points now. So thank you, gentlemen. The email will go out later with the recording, podcast, slides, links, everything to contact for any questions. And I hope everyone has a great day. So thanks for joining us, Brad, Chang-Chi, and David. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.